Yeah. Well, Good morning, Vietnam. Everyone can have a seat. We're going to get started soon. We'll give you a 3-minute. There's a 3-minute warning. There are bathrooms, by the way, downstairs if you need them. And we'll start in 3 minutes. Thanks.
How are you today? Nice morning?
Morning.
Yeah. Well, good morning and welcome to DataDriven, the symposium organized by the Faculty of Journalism of the School of Media Studies and Information Technology. My name is Guillermo Acosta. I'm the Dean of the school, and I'm quite proud and pleased to be here. Humber's elder, Shelley Charles, was unable to join us today, but it is my honor to read the land acknowledgement prepared by Shelley, honoring our indigenous roots. Humber's central campus is located in Adobica, place of the elders, in the Ojibwe language. It is uniquely situated along the Humber River watershed, which historically provided an integral connection for Aboriginal peoples between the Ontario Lakeshore and the Lake Simcoe Georgian Bay region. Known as the traditional territory of the Ojibwe and Anishinaabe people, it includes several First Nation communities throughout the area. In keeping with this indigenous perspective of connection of the land and its original inhabitants, Humber College is committed to increasing awareness and knowledge of the First Peoples of Canada. In alignment with our academic reasons for achieving the goals outlined in the Indigenous Education Protocol and inspired by the Truth and Reconciliation Committee of Commissions of Canada's outcomes, Humber will highlight the historical and contemporary contributions and achievements of the original peoples, respecting the primary importance of indigenous cultural foundations and guided by the principles of mutual respect, inclusion, and community engagement. I'm quite pleased to be here. I'm quite proud that our school is sponsoring this symposium. This signals the direction that our journalism and communications programs are taking. I agree with the notion that there's a lot of attention, but there's little trust. Lots of distracting voices out there, and lack of substance. High decibels of meaningless noise that distract and confuse. But people are thirsty for clarity and meaning. Data-driven journalism and communications in general can help with that. Can help moving from attention to trust. And I think we have a responsibility to do that as a media school. People want compelling but trustworthy storytelling. Storytelling that informs, educates, enhances understanding, and reduces confusion. The amount of data collected every day is staggering and growing at an incredibly fast speed. I've heard many times, if these walls could talk, well, guess what? They do now. With all the sensors that we have here, all the data that's been accumulated is incredible, everywhere, connecting our buildings, our homes, our cities. Data that is everywhere. It is available to all of us with tons of stories to be told, to be uncovered and told. However, critical thinking and common sense can't be replaced. Nothing replaces your years of experience as journalists. I was in a talk to our students about design thinking a couple of days ago. And it was with the design thinking experts and talking about the future of technology and design and the influence of artificial intelligence. And he said something that for me resonated a lot. He said, it's not about artificial intelligence, it's about augmented intelligence. And it's about how we can use all these tools to augment our intelligence and be better storytellers and produce, transform data into information that can really inform and be trusted by people. I really think that this applies to data-driven journalism, and I think that this is something that we will be discussing today, about your experience doing this, how we can do it better, and what's the future of this ready for the discipline. So thank you to our faculty of journalism for organizing this symposium, especially to David for putting this together, all the work that we did behind this, and I'm really looking forward to a very, very important and interesting day today. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Andrew Andrew. I'm the Associate Dean here I cover broadcast television journalism and all that kind of stuff in film. And David, come on up, David. David is a professor, faculty in our diploma program in journalism. Hi, David. Hello. We are a low-budget conference symposium, okay? We're just going to get that out now. I'm the AV guy, okay? So any of the panelists who are here, I can help you out with AV because we're going to just do this extemporaneously a little bit. We have some snacks back there. The bathrooms are downstairs. And that's all I want to say, and I'll pop back up once in a while and say hi, and take it away, David.
All right, I'll be really quick because I want to get to the data show and tell. But I'd just like to welcome everyone here today for being willing to spend your Saturday getting nerdy with us and a bunch of journalists. Having fun with what we do, having fun with computers. We hope you'll enjoy it. I'd like to thank everyone who made today possible. First, our sponsors, Humber College's School of Media Studies Information Technology, the Humber School of Business, Google News Labs, and the Canadian Association of Journalists. Next, the faculty and staff of Humber Journalism program really stepped up to help with this, and especially our administrative coordinator, Melissa Modelow. Where's Melissa? She's there, she's in the back prepping for the next thing. So thank you. And I just want to say that DataDriven takes its inspiration from similar events around the world hosted by groups like the Investigative Reporters and Editors and Google News Labs. And these conferences are excellent, but they always focus on issues that are more particular to the US or other parts of the world and don't always line up with the realities of reporting in Canada. So in a very Canadian way, we wanted to politely but firmly step out from under the shadow of our international counterparts and highlight Canada's award-winning journalism community, many of whom are here either about to go up on the stage or in the audience today, and celebrate the excellent work they're producing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica Wolf, and I hope you all enjoy.
Hello, welcome. I'm Jessica Wolf. I'm a professor here in the Lakeshore campus in digital communications Innovations in Journalism. And it's my pleasure to be starting things off with the Data Show and Tell panel. So each of our 4 panelists, who I'm going to welcome up maybe to the stage now, come up and sit down, I've brought a project to show you. So we are going to run through their projects, and I'm going to start by introducing each of them and then turn things over to them. You'll have time to ask them your questions at the end. So we're beginning with Tara Seolke. Tara Seolke discovered data while working as an editor and reporter in Toronto. She completed a Master's of Investigative and Data-Driven Journalism at the University of King's College and has since worked at the Globe and Mail, CBC, and now at Maclean's, where she is the resident data nerd. Roberto Rocha is a data journalist at the CBC in Montreal, where he's part of a national investigative team. Before that, he worked for 10 years in several roles at the Montreal Gazette, where he first made his bones in the data branch. Now, Shiab is a data reporter for the news magazine L'Actualité in Montreal. His job is to use his coding skills to produce exclusive stories that are out of reach for other media outlets. His ultimate goal is to build an army of bots that would work for him, so he'll be able to listen to podcasts and drink coffee all day. We hope you get enough of it today. And finally, Jessie Gomes is a web developer for CBC News Interactives in Toronto, where she's worked on developing a mapping platform for reporters, as well as building long-form projects. Prior to the CBC, she worked for the Toronto Star and iPolitics. So welcome all of you, and I'm so excited for your presentations.
Okay, I haven't used this in a very long time, so please bear with me.
Better leave it because we want it to the screen too.
Yeah, okay. Is it up?
Yeah.
I can't see it. Okay, perfect. So again, I'm just going to repeat, thanks for coming today. It's awesome to see so many people here early on Saturday morning. I hope that you're all caffeinated, seeing as we're going to be talking about data today. I want to talk about a piece that we put together over the summer. It's called Wooing America, 64 cities, 44 states, and 300 contacts inside Canada's 6-month mission to one-up the White House and in the next NAFTA negotiations, one handshake at a time. Before I dive into it, there are a couple of reasons that I want to share this story in particular. I'll talk about each one a little bit more later, but to quickly sum up, this story was, the data used for the story was actually created in-house. It wasn't something that was applied or scraped or a specific request from a specific level of government. And compiling your own data set, especially on maybe a smaller scale, is something that you see very often, but I feel like there could be more opportunity for compiling your own data set and using that as the basis of a story. And I think this is a great example. The data collection was done alongside the storytelling, and the final data set played a large role in the final product. But it was also shared within the newsroom fairly early. And I would just want to disclaimer, Nick Taylor-Racy is here, and he is the one that, he's kind of the brainchild behind this, and did a lot of the work in his byline, but a lot of people within the greater newsroom work together to kind of bring the story to life. So we also use a lot of visual aids, but we were selective about which ones we did. We had a lot of discussion about them, which ones would support the story, and we tried to be judicious about which ones we did use. And like I said, I want to show this example because it is a good example of cross newsroom collaboration and what teamwork can really bring together. So I would urge you, if you do have questions, that Nick is also there, and then we'll be happy to answer them, I'm sure. So there's a piece of, when I talked to Nick, there was the reason this came up, there was a couple of articles, there was one on Vice, there was one in the New York Times, about Canada's strategy. The New York Times called it the donut strategy, if I remember correctly. But they all write about just the concept. What they didn't include, was how large the scale was of what is being called the charm offensive. So Nick thought he could do better and decided to track every meeting between a Canadian government official and any American politician. So we started going through the schedules of major Canadian politicians, cabinet ministers, diplomats, some key premiers, and city mayors. And luckily for him and us, a lot of politicians, when they do these meetings, are very happy to talk about it on social media. So in combining the government schedules as well as social media, we were able to see just an idea of how full scale this approach to the charm offensive was. So here are just a couple examples of things that we found. This next one is one of my favorites. I like the big set in the back. And so the result of all that work became a spreadsheet. And at no point did we talk about this list being completely exhaustive. The story says so as well. And Nick shared, something that was great is that Nick shared his presentation, the spreadsheet with me in the early days. And Nick is one of the most data-friendly reporters you could probably find, and so everything was nicely laid out. Every variable was in its own column. I really didn't have to do much to it. There were a couple things. We added a couple columns that we had talked through, such as state lobby versus state visited, level of politician, the political leanings, so that we could do some high-level analysis later on. Like I said, here are a couple examples: the number of meetings by a politician, number of Republicans and Democrats lobbied, meetings versus visits, the positions. So just a couple of things in the data collection stage that would allow us to have a better picture later on. And so the database really informed Nick's reporting a lot. The opening anecdote, which we talked about the other day, has to do with these three men, three ministers of agriculture, essentially for the different countries. And the opening anecdote, I won't spoil it for you, because I think you should read the story. But that was traced through geolocating tweets, and that gave a hint for the reporting. And we even said yesterday, we talked about this again yesterday in preparation, and we talked about even in the editing process, he kind of saw each edit as there was a part of the story that was moved. He saw it as a row being moved somewhere along the line, because it was just throughout, the data was throughout the story the whole time. So when I came to presenting the information, we also had quite a few discussions about that, about what would help illustrate the main point of the story, what's possible in the timeline that we had. There was some other, we ended up having to publish a story a little bit sooner than we had anticipated. So timeline was an issue for that as well. We settled on a few. One is what we decided to map out the states visited compared to the states lobbied in order to show just how much physical ground was covered, but also just how many states were lobbied in the process, as well as what states were targeted. So you can see that Florida, Texas, and California were lobbied quite heavily, which makes sense with some other data that we also decided to combine in the story. We also decided to go with a heat map and calendar combination. This was to show the duration of the charm offensive and how long people were lobbying. Then we highlighted some big numbers. Again, like I said, this came out of columns that we had added to the spreadsheet and gathering, just so that we could have some options for these big numbers as well. And then we also pulled out a couple key players and made profile cards for them, kind of highlighting, like these are essentially our row in the spreadsheet with these people and how many meetings they've done, etc. But it puts more of a face to this charm offensive that we've heard so much about. And then One of our designers also put together a map that became the main art online as well as in print. But you can see in this as well how much even the visuals for the story was informed by the database or the data set. So each line kind of represents a row in the data from where the politician left from and went to. And then last but not least, we also decided to use the Height Foundation tool so that readers could go through and see just how many meetings there were. And that's it.
Yeah, I see it on Google Drive.
Okay, let's,
Okay, one, go to that.
go to the next person and then I'll set you up over here. Yes, you Yeah.
Thank you for this great invitation to talk here this morning. I'm working in French in Montreal. I'm a data reporter in Montreal for the news magazine L'Actualité. So if there is something that you don't understand because of my charming accent, just let me know. I wanted to start with 3 very important guiding principles for me when I work on a data story. First, it's very important for me to use code to produce stories out of reach for the human brain alone. Secondly, I never start with a database. I always start with a question, and from this question, I try to find the right data to answer it. And it's very important for me to always learn something new when I do a story. I'm going to talk about a story I published earlier this year it was an exclusive story, data story, on Canadian exploitations of military goods. The first step for me is to find, of course, an idea of a story and to write an hypothesis. And during the last federal campaign in 2015, there was a story that I found very interesting. It was about the deal with Saudi Arabia for military vehicles. And when I read the story, I thought, there's probably somewhere a place, a database, where I could find not just this deal, but all the deals. Because I'm a data reporter, so I'm not interested by one event, I'm interested by all the events, and I want to know everything about all of them. With a quick Google search, I found a report, a public report, on the website of the government, and it was written that there was a report about exports of military goods since 1990. So I knew from that I would be able to gather all the data for the past 25 years. And if you look at the right of the screen, that's the data. So you can see that for each year, there was a list of each country where we sent military goods, we sold them, military goods, and you have the detail. For example, the first line means that in Algeria in 2015, we sold for $50,000 of 210. 210 means small firearms. So I knew that I would be able to gather all the data of this kind for the last 25 years. While reading the report, I also learned that we have guidelines. So the way it works in Canada, if I'm a weapon maker and I want to sell firearms to France, for example, I will have to ask the government the permission to do that. And the government would review my request and then say yes or no. And to decide on this, the government has guidelines that he's supposed to follow. So for me, it was very easy to identify a research hypothesis. It's basically Canada violates its own guideline. And all the work after this was to try to infer or confirm my hypothesis. And I had to find data to do this. The way I work, when I have an idea of a story, I do a bit of some research, very basic research. I write a methodology, and then I contact experts of the field to talk about methodology with them. I have this idea, I'm trying to find if it's true or not. What do you think about it? I do this all the time for my big stories, and it's very important to do that at the beginning, because if you start working on a story and your methodology is wrong, or maybe some researcher already did this work, it means that you just wasted your time. So my idea was to take all the data for the past 25 years of Canadian exports of military goods, that's on the left, and I wanted to cross-reference this data with 3 other academic databases. The first one is a database. It's basically a list of all conflicts in the past 30 years anywhere in the world. So with this database, I would be able to know if we sent weapons in a country that was into a civil war, for example. The political terror scale is a list of all countries for all the past 30 years, I think also, and it's basically saying if there's violations of human rights in the countries. And the third one is a database, a list of countries, again per year, saying if the country is a democracy or a dictatorship. So my idea was pretty simple. But in data, everything gets very complicated very quickly. First, to get all the data of the past 25 years of military exploitations, I had to find the data. So some of the documents, some of the data was just PDF on the website of the government. Some were HTML files. Some were photocopies I made myself in some public libraries. And I even had pictures of an employee of Archive Canada who, during her lunch hour, went to the Special Reserve to find the only copy of one of the reports and took picture with her mobile phone. So I had to put all of this into a beautiful CSV file. It took several weeks. And I had to convince my boss that that was very important work, even if I didn't know if I would confirm my hypothesis. But once, when I had all my data of exploitations, I had another problem. The 3 databases I identified were huge, and I couldn't cross-reference the data myself. So I used some coding skills to do a Python script that cross-referenced everything for me. Some of the data was in French, some of the data was in English. It would have been too complicated to do all the translations myself, so I coded a script that did that for me, and it gave me another beautiful CSV file, thanks to the robot who crunched the data. But it was still too complicated. I started with 4 databases, now I had 1, but it was still a huge database, too complicated for me to understand. So I did another Python script. And at that time, I decided that I would create a score. For each exportation, I would create a score telling me if it was a good or bad idea to export in this country. Basically, the score is very simple. Each time one of the guidelines was violated in some way, my bot would do a +1 to the score of this exportation. So at the end, the higher the score was, the worse was the export. And as you can see, it's just a column on the left of my file. And then I got my first results, and I realized that it actually worked. I found some very interesting exploitations that the government of Canada approved, even if it was probably a bad idea. My favorite one is at the bottom right. We sold for $500,000 in firearms in Russia in 2014, even if at that time Russia was invading Crimea. And the government of Canada was publicly saying that it was a terrible thing that was happening. But at the same time, we sold them firearms. In data journalism is just journalism at its core. So a very important question I had when I had my first results was just who is accountable for this? I did some research. I found out that in 2014 and 2015, the weapons makers asked more than 7,000 times the government the permission to export weapons in other countries, and the government just refused 10 of the requests. So that's a refusal rate of 1.1%. That was a very good line in my report. After all that, it was time to write my story. I did a 2,400 words story for the magazine. I also did a data visualization. After coding in Python, it was time to code in JavaScript with D3 to do a data visualization for our website. And the last step, I'm sure all the data reporters know what I'm talking about. Before publication, you can't sleep. You're not able to because you're just thinking of the hundreds of lines of code that you made, and you're just wondering, did I forget a comma somewhere? And everything is false. So that's the way my brain works. I have some extra slides. Okay, yeah. Just to recap, welcome in my life. I love patterns, and I realized that I have a precise pattern when I work. And it's always the same thing. The first step, when I have my first idea, I feel great. I'm sure it's going to be an awesome story. I go to my boss's office. I'm telling him, give me all the 1 year to do this story. It's going to be amazing. He knows me. He knows it's probably not true, but he says yes, it's fine. Then I talk to some experts, and I do my methodology, and I realized that my first idea, actually, I was too optimistic. Then you do your research, and you code, because you have too much data, you don't know where you're going, and your motivation just goes down, and that's the longest step. Then you have your first results. You feel great again. At some point you realize that you have to talk to humans and do interviews. Then you do some more code, you do data visualization with D3. Oh, it's amazing, it's so beautiful. Sometimes it doesn't work on mobile, but... And then the last step, publication in Insomnia. And you just want... You think you have a good story, but nobody at your office is able to check your code. So everything is on your shoulders, and you hope that you will have a call the next morning saying, hey, I look at your data, everything is wrong. So that's the way I work.
Thank you very much. All right, everyone. Quick reminder, I'm Roberto. I'm a data journalist at the CBC, work in Montreal. So I'm not going to give you so much of a show and tell. This is going to be more of a show and warn. Because what I'm going to show you, the way I did this project, a lot of it was just wrong, right? It was just, I chose possibly the worst way to go about this. And I didn't figure this out until close to the end. And this is something that that will happen when you do something that you've never done before. When you do something that few people or no one has done before, you will do it the wrong way, and that's all right. But you won't know until you get to the end, and you've wasted all these precious hours, possibly weeks, possibly months. So the takeaway from this is don't do what I did, and hopefully you can learn from my mistakes. So I'm going to talk about this project I did for Montreal's 375th anniversary, which was last year. And I want to do something big and historic and that kind of celebrates the history of the city. So I created this map of pretty much every building on the island of Montreal, about 350,000 of them, colored by its year of construction. And as you scroll down the story, the map pans, and we highlighted about 30 iconic buildings throughout the history that represented a point in time, either an architectural philosophy or something that really was marked an important moment in that history. And as you scroll down and that building gets highlighted, the map pans to that place on the map. First of all, it's not an original idea. It was very well received, but it was not an original idea. Something similar was done in New York City. This is a map that it's very slow actually, but it works. When you hover over a building, it shows you the year it was built, and that's it. But what's great is that New York City, the data for this map was public. It was open data in the city's website. Both the year of construction and the actual polygons, the shapes of the actual buildings that you can map. This was all freely available, so someone just had to get that and throw it on a mapping program. Something similar was done in Barcelona. Same thing. They had access to all this great data that the city had, both for the geography of the buildings and the year of construction. It's also very slow to load. So I wanted to go one step better. I wanted to make it more performant and also make it a little more narrative. Actually tell a story with the history of these buildings. But in Montreal, we don't have this data nicely already prepackaged and ready to use. The year of construction of buildings, the only place where you can get that is in the tax assessment office, the tax evaluation office, right? And that's a website that has all these captures, and you can only see one record at a time. So it is, first of all, it's impossible to scrape because of these captures. So that means I have to do access to information requests. I have to get the city to give me that data. And they did. This is what it looked like. We had a column for the street name, for the year of construction, the address, the generic, right, boulevard, avenue, street. And it's only for the city of Montreal. Now, the island of Montreal it has about 12 municipalities there. But I only got it for the actual city of Montreal, so it was already incomplete to start with. And if you look at the second column here, that's the year of construction. A lot of them, many tens of thousands of records. The year of construction was 0000. Now, what does that mean? That they don't know, it's missing, the record was lost, maybe it was built during the time of Jesus of Nazareth, right? We don't know, yeah, could be all these things. And the city didn't have an answer, really. It's like, we don't know, we just don't have it. We just don't have it. It's just a missing value. So that's something you have to consider, right? You start with incomplete data, what do you do with that? So, and I mentioned that I only got it from the city of Montreal, which means I had to ask all these other municipalities to give me their tax assessment data so I get their year of construction too. And this is one from the city of Westmount, and it's the only other municipality out of the other 10 or 11 that actually gave it to me, because they actually had it digitized like this. One municipality called the town of Mount Royal, which is kind of right in the middle of the island, they have the year of construction for their buildings, and it looks like this. They are handwritten cards, and they offered to scan about, I don't know, 10,000 for me for the very low cost of thousands of dollars. So I said, no thanks, I'll just stick with the main city investment. Now, I said that showed you that there's a lot of missing data. And a lot of these missing years were for the most interesting part of the city, which is Old Montreal. And I couldn't possibly have a historical map of the city without having a complete picture of Old Montreal. Thankfully, a bunch of academics researched every single building in the old city, looked through historical records, and they built this pretty cool website where you have basically a file for every single building in the old city with its year of construction that was verified. So that's awesome. And they were very nice and gave me the data behind it for year of construction. Now I have three very different structured data sets that I had to somehow harmonize, so I could actually have a complete single spreadsheet. Now, I only have the addresses and the year of construction in this data. How do I know where they were, right? Where they were on the map? Yes, I can do something called geocoding, but with about 350,000, that would take a lot of time. It could have been expensive. There's a lot of room for error, right? It's not a perfect thing. Thankfully, the city of Montreal has, on its open data portal, has a really cool data set, which is the geographical location of every single address on the island. That's really great. It looks like this. And it's a centroid, a point for every building. And this is the data, what the data actually looks like behind these little points. We have the street name, the number, the generic, if it's a boulevard or street, and so on and so forth. Now let's look back at the data I got from the city. Look at the first column. All uppercase, right? Look at column F, the generic. It has the abbreviation of the generic designation. The point data that I have to join it with, it's in sentence case and actually has the accents, the diacritical marks on the letters, on the names. Now, if you've ever done any kind of table joins, you know that it has to be exactly identical, right, where you want to join. And the only possible way I can join is on the address name of these two tables. So I had to find a way to make this join up with this so I can have the year of construction on these little points. So to do this, like Niall, I spent many restless weeks just writing a bunch of horrible code that I'm ashamed if anybody else would find it and read it, that tries to make things similar between the two data sets. Make the turn bool and roux, and also bool and ave into boulevard and avenue, so I can do the join. Make the streets written the same with the accents where they should be. And I was writing this code, doing these conversions, and then doing the join in QGIS. So I was going from Python to QGIS to try to map it. And I went back and forth about 20 times until I found that, probably more than that, until I found that enough of them, or most of them, had joined, like a significant amount were properly joined. So I could end up with the last column like that, which is a complete address. The last address column, which coincides with the one in the point data. So it took about a week or two to do that. And I ended up with my nice little points with the year of construction. associated with them. So nice, I have a bunch of little dots on the map with, that are colorful. That's nice, but I want to see the buildings. I want to show the shapes of the buildings, right? And where do I get these polygons for these buildings? Well, the city doesn't have it. Who does it? OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap is like the Wikipedia of map. People just go in there and add things to the world, and it is free for anyone to use. But because it's crowdsourced, it's user-driven, it's incomplete. This is what the buildings, the shapes of the buildings look like in Montreal. You can see it's nice and dense and complete in the center, but on the outer, sort of the peripheral neighborhoods, there isn't much there. Here's a close-up. This is downtown and Westmount NDG area. Pretty much every building is there. This is awesome. Like, they really did a great job. But you go a little further, this neighborhood called Verdun-LaSalle, there's almost nothing. It's probably like the people who live there and they did their own little house on the map, and it's very incomplete. So I had to deal with that. I had to think about, okay, how am I going to do this? I want to show the buildings, but I have some buildings and the rest are going to be dots. I guess I'm going to have to live with that. Because there's no way I'm going to, trace every, the missing 100,000 buildings by hand. And finally, I just had to join both of them. So I had my dots with the ears on them, and I had my polygons, or just empty polygons with no data attached. So I had to associate the ear of these little dots with these empty polygons. And you have to do what's called a spatial join. Basically tell the program, if a little dot falls inside a polygon, give the data of the dot to the polygon. And that comes with its own problems, because not all the dots fall neatly inside polygons. As you can see, there is one little dot that's kind of between two buildings. And the computer is an idiot. It will only assign it to one. You won't know that it's like two buildings for one record. So you have to deal with that too. You have to do a lot of manual inspections, see which polygons were not assigned a dot, and do a lot of fixing by hand. And that took a long time too, probably another week or two of just fixing things manually. Now, this was a very tortuous, unnecessary process. Because if I had thought just a little bit harder in the beginning, if I had been slightly more ambitious, I could have spared myself weeks of work. Why? Well, let's go back to the data set I got from the city. Looks like this, right? Because I'm so used to Montreal and Quebec being so stingy with data. Like, as a defensive move, I asked for sometimes like the bare minimum needed to get the job done. So I said, just give me the address and the year of construction from the tax assessment office. Had I known, if I had asked for more stuff, everything, I would have gotten this column called matricule, which is the unique ID of land parcels, and that has the damn coordinates of the buildings in it. You use a formula, you can convert that to latitude and longitude with the year of construction already in there. Yes. And I only found this out when I did a show and tell similar to this in Montreal, and there was someone from the city, and she was smashing her head the whole time. Like, Roberta, why didn't you ask for more data? We would have given it to you. So think a little bit ahead of time. Do a little bit more research, talk to people. The worst they can say is no, and then you have to do this horrible thing that I did, but they might say yes, and it can spare you so much pain. But the end product, in the end, we were pretty satisfied. it looked like this. So it was a mix of polygons and dots, right? We had polygons where we had them and dots where we didn't. But it worked pretty well. A lot of gray buildings when we just didn't know the year. Unfortunately, a lot of like institutional buildings like schools, churches, really interesting things, we just don't know. We just didn't know the year. But anyways, it was nice. It took longer than it should have, but anyways, it was nice. So what are the takeaways that I would like to communicate for you? One is be ambitious when you ask for a data, right? Ask for everything first, and then negotiate if they say no. Talk to the people who own the data, who manage it, and tell them what your goal is. And they might just help you out, like the city person could have helped me out. Also, you saw that when I wanted to do the table join of the address, I chose the worst way to do it, which is to turn the uppercase, no accent addresses into sentence case with accents, and I should have done the opposite. I should have just made everything uppercase with no accents, and that was a much easier conversion to do. Do the join, and then I actually do the, and I can actually display the right way later. That would save me a lot of time as well. And there's one last takeaway that I thought about this morning when I was getting changed is, and I already forgot. It is, yeah, it'll come back to me later when we're talking. And that's it. It's my spiel.
Cool. So I'm going to do a quick demo of a mapping tool that I developed at CBC. So hi, Jesse. I work with CBC on the user interactive team based in Toronto. I'm a front-end developer. I spend most of my time working in React, and I spent several months learning and using React to be able to build this mapping platform for reporters and editors at CBC. So I'm just going to do a quick demo of the mapping tool, and then, yeah, it'll be great. So, okay, so I spent, like I said, many months building this mapping tool using React, starting with the idea that we could build something that we could turn over to reporters and editors so that in the instance of a breaking news event or a larger scale project, they would have something that can really quickly turn around a map that can be embedded in a story in our content management system. So I started by building this very big React project. This is the base file that sets up the platform itself. And so this is the mapping tool. I realized this morning that the actual tool itself, the live version, you can only access it from within the building. So this is the local version of the tool. So this is actually a work in progress. So if there are any bugs, which I'm pretty confident there will be, just please forgive me. I'm doing this on the fly, which is so exciting. So this is the mapping tool. And again, I'm a developer. I'm not a designer, so please don't judge me for how atrocious this looks. If there's any designers in the room, again, I apologize. So this mapping tool allows reporters to either build a map using a Google spreadsheet or a CSV file, or adding individual points using an address. So if you have a map with minimal number of points, you can use this geocoder to actually look up and find an address and add it to the map. And I should mention also that we use Mapbox as our mapping platform. So I'm working with Mapbox, and Mapbox is geocoder. So I can find an address on using my geocoder, and then adding content for a pop-up and for body content. And then I've also got this fun little library that allows you to add styling to the text. And then you can add it to the map using either a marker, symbol, icon, or using a straight color option. So you can also resize the size of the map point or the opacity, and then you can add it to the map. And there you go. We've got somewhere in Toronto with a very large marker. But what I think is way more cool, which is way cooler and way more useful for folks, is actually being able to load multiple lines, multiple points at one time, either using a CSV or importing it directly from Google Spreadsheets. So I'm just going to just grab this UFO data. So one of my colleagues was sent this spreadsheet of every UFO sighting in Canada in 2012. So I've got this cleaned up and converted into a CSV that works with our tool. The column headers are necessary. That's what is like that. This structure basically. Sorry, my point is that I've taken the UFO data that you sent me and I converted it into the structure I need for the tool. So I will just grab this UFO data as a CSV. I'm going to copy it from Sublime, and then I can input it into our mapping tool. Oops, wrong one. Add it to our mapping tool here, submit it, let it parse. It'll take a minute. Just needs to warm up. And then I can update my preview, and it'll actually show me, in a second, every point that was in that CSV. And these all, this map, which I've now completed, represents UFO sightings in 2012 in Canada. And each point is color coordinated based on the color of the UFO sighting, as well as sized by, I think, the number of people who witnessed the UFO sighting at each point. And then obviously when you hover or you click, you can get the pop-up information. I have a slightly nicer version of it here. Oh, no. A slightly nicer version of it here. So very quickly, we are able to generate from big data sets maps super quickly. And then you would just grab this embed code and add it to our content management system. So the goal of the project was enabling reporters or editors to very quickly and on the fly build maps. And that was, and so yeah, this embed code would go into our content management system and you'd be able to publish a map pretty quickly. Obviously the data work of getting the correct file structure and all that stuff would be done beforehand, but once you have a complete data set, it's pretty cool that in about 60 seconds you're able to very quickly compile a map. And I'll just walk through, I've got some other features, like you can add text header for the map, you can add a legend when there's content that is coordinated, like when you have a point on the map, you can explain obviously why that point is colored in the way it is, which is handy. And then the rest of this functionality is pretty straightforward. This, I would also mention, is version 1 of this tool. There's a lot of features and functionality that needs to be added. For example, being able to upload polygon shapes. You can't do that just yet. You can draw on the map and add a line in that way. But a future development project for me is being able to actually have the ability for a reporter to upload a shape file or a camera file or whatever to actually work with existing shape files. Yeah, and that's about it. This was a fun project for me. It's funny because I'm very bad with geography and maps to begin with. So I like to call myself directionally illiterate. I don't know north and south, despite the fact that I live in a... Anyways, so it's funny to me that I was the one who was tasked with building a mapping tool, but I feel like it worked out pretty well people with the ability to tell north and south are able to use it, and that was the goal. The next, I think the big task of having a tool like this obviously is ongoing maintenance. Development work, working with reporters and editors across our very large newsroom, and I work for the CBC, so our newsroom in Toronto is pretty big, but also we have many regions, so getting this tool into the hands of reporters not only in Toronto, but in Saskatchewan, and Vancouver, and Halifax, that has been, I think, the secondary challenge. The initial challenge is telling north and south. My second challenge is getting it into the hands of folks to be able to get the features and functionality that they would need on a daily basis when they're in a breaking news event, and they just need to be able to show 3 points or show a path someone took in a news story. So that's exciting. The other thing I want to add is the ability to have other stuff. There's stuff in my brain, but basically my point is maps are cool. I was really excited to be able to get large files uploaded really quickly and have the ability of reporters and editors to turn out maps in less than 5 minutes.
Thank you, Jesse, and all of our presenters. I want to invite you back up to the stage, maybe to take a seat in these orange chairs. We're going to have a chat. I'm sure the audience has loads of questions. I have loads of questions, but I want to start by inviting the 4 of you to ask each other your questions. I'm sure you all have questions for each other, so please, what are your burning questions?
So Tara, I was just wondering, in your database you had several sources, if I understood well, several people were working with the database as well. I was just wondering if you had rules to be sure that the data would stay reliable. Yes, this word.
We actually did it. It was all Nick in his spare time, plugging away and cross-referencing the government schedules in the social media accounts. So in that sense, it was good to just have that one person, because when you introduce more, like you said, it can be a mess when people have different definitions of what means and how they, even spelling, those all make a difference. So good question, but one person. I'm gonna throw it back at you, and I'm gonna ask, you mentioned you had 3 separate databases, and Roberto took us through how he merged everything. Can you take us through how you did that?
It's hell. Because for me, as Roberto said, you need a unique ID for each event. For me, the unique ID was the name of the country and the years. But I was covering 25 years. So some countries disappeared, some of them changed names, some of them had a name in a specific language, not necessarily in English, some was in French. So I had to code a function that would tell me every time something wasn't usual, and then manually decide what I was going to do with it. My way to do this, to standardize everything, is to code as much functions as possible to decide for me. So I don't have to spend too much time in it. But at some point you have to go clean it manually. It's the only way. But it's basically a lot of code until you die.
I have a question for you, Naya, as well. So you requested the data, you did all the analysis, all the joining, you wrote the story, and then you did the front-end development for the scroller, right? That one, first of all, hats off, that is ridiculously impressive. Because that's usually, that's something that you would think, in some organizations, it's a team, it will be a team effort, right? So
my question is, when you do all the whole pipeline of the project, and that means you have to be sort of a generalist instead of a specialist, right? What kind of trade-offs does that involve, where you have to be, do the whole thing and you can't specialize in one thing?
Yeah, there's two visions of this. As you said, there's some people say that you should be a specialist and you should really focus on one specific thing. Like, for example, JavaScript coding, so you can do visualizations, web apps, or you could specialize in data analysis, and you will probably learn how to code in Python and use pandas and all that. But I think this works for big newsrooms where you can work. You are able to get a team to work together. In my case, I work for a smaller media outlet, L'Actualité. We are actually 7 full-time reporters. So if I want a data visualization, I have to code it. Nobody else will code it for me, and actually nobody else knows how to code it. So I have to learn it. And that's the reason why in my personal principles, I have a principle saying that each time I'm doing a story, I need to learn something new. Because I'm a generalist, that's hard to say if you are a French. So I need that. And it's really hard to keep up each skill at the right level. For example, D3, there's a 4th version of D3. I just started using it, even if it's been like a year ago that the update was made. So it's hard. It's hard. But a big advantage I see as well is that when I start working in my story, I already know what I will need at the end. So, for example, the data visualization for the exportations of military goods, I knew that I had to do this data visualization. I wanted to do it. So since the beginning, from scratch, I knew that I had to keep some data in a specific format for my data visualization at the end. So I wouldn't have to do the work back and forth for the last step. So.
Well, my question is, when you want to have this done, your project done for the anniversary, when did you pitch it, and can you take us through how you did that, knowing that there are going to be stumbling blocks along the way?
When did I pitch it? It was in 2016, I had the idea, actually. I was linked to Radio-Canada, to the French service of CBC for a couple of months. I was sort of their embedded data nerd in their multi-platform team that does all this, all the digital stuff that you see on the Radio-Canada site. And it was one idea that I pitched them, and they said, sure, it's a good one for the 375th. So you want to know the process of the pitch? I said, how far ahead? I think I had the idea in 2016, and I started on it, working on it maybe in January, February 2017, and it was published in around April. But it wasn't a very tough sell. They said, sure. Yeah, sounds good. Take your time. Take your time and get with it.
Yeah, I will ask the audience.
And please project.
Yes. I know one of the things that comes up is like you're doing all this work and you know in the back of your head that maybe at the end you're not going to confirm your hypothesis. When you go to presentations like this, obviously you hear about the projects that were successful, but how often does it happen that you go through a bunch of this data analysis and you find actually everything seems to be fine and there's no story here?
All those mics are live, by the way.
Okay, but I think we don't need the mic. In my case, it's almost a third, almost a third of my stories. But that's the reason why I have the methodology at the beginning of my process and the interviews with the experts. Because very quickly, the experts will tell me, no, this is insane. Like, there's no data to confirm or infirm this. Or I already did this analysis, there's nothing, don't do it. I could give you an example. In Montreal, in Quebec, we have 18 universities, and I was very curious about the long-term debt of Quebec universities. I found some data fairly quickly, and I talked to a guy who studied this for 20 years. And I told him, this is what I want to do. He told me, there's no story there. I tried it, like, for the last 20 years, I look at it every year, and there's nothing, don't waste your time. Okay. I already talked to my boss about it. But he's used to it. So, yeah, so a third. Rock.
This could be for anyone on the panel, but I'm just curious, like after you've done this, you've posted your story and everything, do you ever release this data to the public or back to the city?
Yeah, can you hear me? Is this live? Okay. Sometimes. It depends on how sensitive the data is. If it's something like, I don't know, like your constructions of the building with, with all the polygons, sure, that's fine. But there are some data sets there that could be possibly, by a very clever hacker, could be personally identifiable. Or it's something that a data set that we received on condition that the data is not, shouldn't be released, right? One of these was, for example, I did a project on Kickstarter projects. Like I visualized like 10 years of Kickstarter projects in Canada, like city. And there's a company that harvests this data for that's their business. We did a partnership there and say, okay, you can use this, you can visualize it, but just don't give it away. So, but as a general rule, I think data should be shared. Our job as journalists is to fight for transparency, and we should be transparent as well with both the data we use and the techniques we use to analyze that data.
Kind of following on the heels of that last question, I'm wondering how you think, any of you on the stage who are especially building out data sets that were incomplete to begin with, how you think about the longevity, duration of your work. And the internet tends towards chaos. We are all 2 redesigns away from everything being subtly or considerably broken. How do you think about that kind of lasting effect, especially when you're doing work that is kind of in the public service rather, that involves building out considerable data sets that probably nobody else has?
I think that's a question that everybody's kind of grappling with at the moment. And I guess one of the only things I would say is having multiple copies in multiple different file formats, just so that you can attempt to preserve it in a way that will hopefully be friendly in the future. But yeah, I think it's something everybody's thinking about.
It's a great question because like Farrah said, it is a major point of anxiety among like data nerds. So much that there is one gentleman in California, data editor for the LA Times. Look him up, Ben Welch. He just created a tool for journalists to archive their stuff because, like you said, a CMS can change and then nothing works anymore. A project that is useful, that has a long shelf life, is now destroyed, right? Continuity and longevity of big digital projects is something that isn't given nearly enough attention that it needs within newsrooms. But like I said, there are people actively working on solutions.
Oh, I was just gonna say, similar to that example, 538 does a really great job of providing the data on GitHub. They have which is GitHub is just a way of storing and making code available. So they, on a lot of their data projects, actually where the byline in an article is, have a find the data link that links back to the project on GitHub, which I think is a great example of like making first of all public the data accessible and also having it somewhere that you would hope isn't too reasoned away from being too broken. But,
or when it comes to like the technical things, like the coding, like where did you guys learn that? Like,
so the question is, where did you learn to code?
yeah, like what are some resources that you guys use to?
Great question. I used to work as a designer doing flat infographics back in like 2010, and I wanted to learn to code, and so I took a Ladies Learning Code workshop, which was a great resource for women specifically, but also men to learn to code in a day-long introductory section. So it's Ladies Learning Code is really great, and then I actually went to HackerU, which is a 9-week boot camp to learn to code. So that's what I did, but other great resources, there's lots of stuff online. Ladies Learning Code there's definitely a chapter in Toronto and in most cities across the country. It's like $50 per day. It's a great way to get your feet wet. Women specifically, there's a program in Toronto called Bridge, which will teach a lot of JavaScript at an introductory level for free. So I would definitely say look that up. They run programs every 3 to 6 months, I think. Bridge.io potentially. But there are like so many online resources. NICAR and NICAR, which is the National Institute for Computer Assisted Reporting, I think it's called. They have a conference every year, and also their website has a lot of really great resources and like old tip sheets. You might have to come remember, but I recommend becoming a member anyways. But lots of like tip sheets of like where to find data, how to structure data. But in terms of like technical learning,
another resource that I've used is actually lynda.com, and Toronto libraries are amazing, and you can have a free subscription through the Toronto Library, which when I was living outside of Toronto, I was paying every month. So when I moved in town, it was kind of a big Hail Mary on that one. There's also things like Code Academy if you want to really get started with that. I remember sitting and doing some stuff with Niall a while ago. But
the most important thing is to take the time, because it's hard, it's long, it's difficult, and you need a project. That's extremely important. I used Code Academy. Actually, I was doing my master's degree with Tara in Halifax at the University of King's College, and we had a small coding class. And I was like, no, I want more. So every morning I spent like 2 or 3 hours on Code Academy for 3 months, 4 months, to be able to do my own scripts with my own idea. But you need ideas. And you need an idea. At the first, you won't be able to produce what you wanted, but you will learn along the way, and that's the way to do it.
I would also say Node School specifically is another like in-person thing. Maybe send me an email because I have a lot of it'll be easier if I just send an email. But my biggest suggestion is like work with someone so that you have that accountability, because I think it's really difficult to learn to code. Like learning to code is like learning a language. It's difficult and it's annoying, and if you get stuck, you need help. And I think often like just peer support is really important. So try and find meetups, like meetup.com, you can find like a crap ton of meetups in Toronto. But like, yeah, have a project, have something to work with, have like another person to work with, try to find a mentor. Like having a mentor in the process of learning to code, I think will make you learn code so much faster, and you'll just like the emotional side of learning to code will be significantly reduced. Anyway, yeah, send me an email because also I'm really passionate about teaching. So.
We have time for maybe one more question. So first of all, thank you all for the great work and interesting presentation. My question is for Niall and Sarah. How did you evaluate the quality of your findings?
I think with ours it wasn't necessarily meant to be exhaustive, and we kind of outlined that in the story that we did all we could do by cross-referencing social media accounts and the schedules, but it wasn't an official documentation of all the meetings, but it was kind of as close as we could get. So it's a little bit difficult to evaluate it in that sense, but since we couldn't really have a strong way of evaluating it other than, getting someone to approve each line, we made sure to outline that in the story as well.
When I sent interviews requests, I sent my latest version of my methodology and all my results. When I was in journalism school, I've always been told, don't send your questions in advance. That's a bad idea. I actually do always the opposite, because otherwise the answers are very vague. And to answer your question, when I sent my methodology, my detailed methodology and all of my results to the Minister Christian Killen, who is responsible for foreign affairs, they refused to answer my questions. And they didn't bring any correction to anything I sent to them, and I gave them weeks to check everything they wanted. So I guess my work was pretty good. Otherwise, they would have said, "There's errors. Don't publish this." But they didn't. That's another way to check that they're not doing anything wrong.
Okay, well, okay. One more. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm a geographer with the City Institute at York University. Just listening to all of you talk is so great, seeing you all hone your geographical literacy in your data journalism. So what I was wondering is, in your forthcoming stories, do you feel like you're warming up to the place-based approach in your data journalism?
Warming up to the place-based approach.
Yeah, doing more stories around location.
Oh yeah. Location is sort of that. I hate to use this horrible business jargon, but it is sort of the low-hanging fruit of data journalism, right? There's just so much good spatial data out there because the tools are so developed around it. Every industry in the universe uses geographical tools, right? Whether a farmer or a police officer or a miner or whatever, right? There is geographical data, and the tools are great for using that. So it's almost you almost feel like you're cheating when you make a map sometimes, because it's just too easy. Let's make a map. You actually have to think harder. How can we make this not a map and tell an interesting story? So I wouldn't even say warming up to the place-based approach. We're deeply in bed with it already.
Okay, thank you very much to all our panelists for your backings up there. That was an amazingly illuminating panel, so thank you. And we're going to reconvene at 10:45, correct? So big round of applause.
Everybody, the bathrooms are downstairs and on the first floor if you want to do that quickly. And we'll start at 10:45. quick notes here. If I can get your attention. I just want to talk about food. Food? You're interested in food, I assume? Yeah, I'm just going to do a couple of those. No, come up here, David. If I can have everyone's attention, David and I, we sort of met in the hallway. I'm the associate dean, and David is an instructor, faculty member who came in. We sort of met and we talked in the hallway all the time. And this sort of came about by just passing through the hallway and saying, hey, we should do this. So it was sort of a gut thing. But we didn't really have any money. Guillermo was kind enough to give us a few bucks. We got coffee from the business school, a couple other dollars here and there. So we're a little bit stressed on the food area there. Stuff will come for lunch, but it'll just sort of be little pickings. Won't be much. Okay, I apologize. But we're all adults here. Most of us can go without food for a while, I think. But if you see up there, there's a little food map. When lunch does come, there is food around here if you walk up to Lakeshore. So I'm just suggesting that if you are hungry, you might want to get on your coat and walk out of here. There's a Rabba up that way, and then the other places are that way, and there's a Tim Hortons over there. Does that make sense to everyone? One other thing, there was a question about how do you learn this stuff. How many students are here? Hands up with students. We've got quite a few students. So part of this learning process, obviously, there's all sorts of places to do it. At Humber College, in our Media Studies Continuing Education, we have a big data certificate, which spins off into more sophisticated analytics. And we have Thialina here. Thialina? Right back here. Thialina is the senior data analyst for TD Bank. So sort of a little cross-pollination with you data journalists. Thialina is punching data for other reasons, but at the foundational level, it's pretty much all the same stuff. In some respects, it's just about the story you're going to tell. So speak to Thialina if you're interested in continuing on your coding journey, if you want to do it at Humber College Media Studies, for example, at our CE. Other than that, David, carry on.
And just a reminder for lunch, I'll do this again, that we do have Frank B. here who's going to be demoing Google Tilegrams at about 12:30. So if you're comfortable just ducking out, grabbing some food quick, or eating the food around here, and then at 12:30 we're going to do a lunch and learn. And without further ado, I'd also like to call up Stuart Thompson to the stage. Stuart is the graphics director for the New York Times Opinion section, formerly of the Wall Street Journal, as well as the Globe and Mail here in Toronto. So I'm going to let Stuart take it away now. And afterwards, David Scott, digital media luminary, will be coming up to discuss with Stuart some interesting things about data journalism. So take it away, Stuart.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, David, for organizing this. This is great to see. There was nothing like this when I was been outside Canada for 4 years, I think now. So there's nothing like this when I was here. So it's great to see this community project. Very excited. So yeah, David and I are going to talk about something about data journalism in the future, maybe past, present. But I wanted to run through a couple of examples of stories that I've worked on and some other things that I've seen around. It's been maybe about 10 minutes, and then we'll get into some conversation. But I want to travel back to one of the first projects that I did on data and talk a little bit how things have changed. This is a story I did for the Globe and Mail about bicycle collisions. So it's kind of like a classic city data journalism story. And I was biking a lot in Toronto, and I almost got doored, which is where like a taxi will come, open up, or a car will come open up the doors. You're like careening into them. I almost got doored, and maybe would have died or something. But maybe started thinking about collisions, and it turns out the police tracked that data, and I was able to contact the right guy who just gave me huge trove of data. And I pitched the story and wrote it, and this was the visual that we did. There it is. accompany that. So at the time, this is back in sort of like the 2010 around then. The link to this visual is sort of buried on the side and sort of like one of the related links there. And it's kind of a sign of the times. At the time, you would sort of write a story, and separately you'd have a database. And that's one of the things that's really changed for the last couple of years, working on more of the visual journalism side, which is sort of like a subcategory of data. And these days, we really integrate those things together, and there's not much sense in having separate stories. Back then, you'd sort of separate them out. And you see here's a big map. The dots are all the collisions. You can kind of filter through. And this is sort of another feature of this early day of data journalism. You'd have a lot of data, and you'd really just want to show that to everybody. Because you'd be personally really excited, like I was, about, look at this thing, this is so cool. This was done in the Google Maps API and Fusion Tables, which is a Google tool that I don't think they've really worked on in like a decade. But yeah, you would put this stuff out there and it'd be like a big data dump. So this is one of the things that we're trying to back away from, both at the Wall Street Journal where I was before and at the Times. They've done this for a while. It's back away from just showing people data. So there's this idea, this hope that people will be as excited about data as we are, and then go through it and filter all this stuff. I'm not sure why you'd want to see like just the 80-year-olds who had like a bicycle collision in Toronto, but that option was there. Over time, you realize people actually don't want to do that. They don't really want to click through a bunch of buttons. They don't really respond to a bunch of data beyond sort of the surface level excitement. So that's one of the things that's changed. When I was at the Wall Street Journal, we worked on a story called Medicare Unmasked. It won the Pulitzer Prize that year. And I played a sort of small role on a very big team that worked on this. And the Wall Street Journal sued this company called CMS that administers Medicare payments for a bunch of data that they didn't want to provide. It's public data, so they should have. And the Journal won that lawsuit and got all this data. So it's tons and tons of data in here. Several years of it. They kept releasing it after we sued for it. And this is sort of similar to the last data example, so it's a big dashboard of things, you can search things, but this is maybe the case that it does make sense to release data to people because you can find yourself in the data, or more accurately in this case, find your own doctor. So you can search for your doctor. If you're going to see a specialist, you can search for them and you can see what are they billing for, are they billing more than other people, and there's a lot of really great stories that came out of this. They did several dozen stories. They found some doctors we found one doctor in particular who was billing for a practice that was not really practiced anymore. It was a more expensive procedure, and he was billing a lot of money for that procedure. And he defended it as saying that it's he thinks it's a better procedure or whatever, but he was making a lot of money out of it. So tons and tons of stories came out of that. And this is another story that they did, which we did a graphic for. And this shows there's in the American healthcare system, you can be admitted to a hospital and they'll pay for a patient's stay up to a certain point, and then they pay much less. So you can see this chart at the top here. These are the days up to what they call the threshold date, and this is the number of discharges. So it's pretty flat. It goes up a little bit. People are getting discharged, and then it kind of follows just a little bit right before that day where there's that big spike. And that's when that patient stops being profitable for the hospital. So they keep them pretty much up to that point, then discharge most of them, and then there's a little long tail after that. So that's just an idea of one of the stories that they were able to pull out of that, and we did this big graphic to go with it. But yeah, that's pretty good. So then I joined the Times earlier this year, and one of the things we can talk about maybe is how the industry is changing. But one of the things the Times started doing is trying to spread the skills around the newsroom in new and different ways. So for a long time, the Times they've had a graphics team that's really been isolated and focused on doing this kind of work, both visual and also they're basically a reporting team. They just work a lot with data and sometimes visualizing. So they've started expanding that around the newsroom. They have an international desk, and an editor there who works on visuals, and they have this new position of opinion. So as you can imagine, opinion is separate from the newsroom. We have our own editing process. We don't talk to the newsroom on a different floor. You have to use a special key to get into our floor now. So they're very, very separated. So they wanted to expand this kind of work into opinion, where you might imagine there's a ton of possibilities, but they need to create a separate team for that. So that's what I've been working on. This is one project that we did when I first got there, and I think it sort of is a nice example of the evolution of data journalism. It might not be what you think about when you think of data journalism, because there are no numbers. Well, there's a couple of numbers, I guess, at the end. This should be moving. There we go. So this is Trump's lies. Lies as we identified them, and our opinion of what he was lying about. And there's a lot of them. This was ended up being the most read opinion story of the year that's found there. So it was very, very popular. Not exactly what you would think of as a data story, but it required a lot of data skills, and it's hard to imagine the story being able to happen without all the work that's done in data journalism over the last decade or so. It's not a conventional narrative. There's no interviews, but it used tools of data journalism, that is a big spreadsheet, and analyzing information into cells and columns, and it's sort of like an alternative story format that data and visual journalism have been pushing for. And it's kind of hard to imagine, to think about it, what is the 600-word story version of this that would have that kind of impact, that would be the most read opinion story. And it's got a lot of attention at the time. Whoopi Goldberg talked about it on The View, so that was like a nice milestone. This story doesn't exist as a 600-word story, or at least it exists in a much poorer version. And that's one of the things that we've been trying to do for the last couple of years is in visuals we have look for visual stories, not stories of visuals, but that maintains the data as well. Look for data stories, not stories of data. So we're not talking about like adding in data to some other stories, like you might just write about things normally, and then it's like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we found some more data that could like slot into this, or wouldn't it be nice if there was a chart? We're really looking for stories that can only be told through visuals and only be told through data, and I think this is one example of that. Okay, so cool. So I want to talk a little bit about the future, which is the name of this talk. And full disclosure, I agreed to this topic on the topic, and then on the topic. So I covered this in a little way. But when I started preparing for this, I had to pull my head up out of my desk and get out of the trenches a little bit and think a little bit for the first time in a while what the future is really looking like. It's a little hard when you're in it to step back and do that, but when I started rereading some of the stories I've come before, there's a couple of things I wanted to know. So AP released this year, a guide for users in the age of smart machines, which has like that really kind of tacky, futuristic title. But one of the things I'm talking about is machine learning, artificial intelligence, algorithmic journalism, and this is one of the things that came up that is an interesting avenue for the future. It's not something I've personally done, and only there's a couple of teams, a couple of people that are working on this, but it's an exciting point. And there's a couple of good stories that I can talk about. This one from the LA Times. They started looking at police reports and noticed that the police were miscategorizing the report based on whether it was a serious injury or serious offense or a minor offense. And you can imagine trying to report the story without any data. Like, how might you do that? You might talk to a lot of cops, you might look for anecdotes, and then write your story around that. Like, we found like 6 different reports. They seem to be miscategorized. Police maybe have a motivation to make their crime stats look better than they actually are, and that would be that. And then the police might say, "You're totally wrong. We don't do that." And in the age, sort of like the fake news age, it's a really important time for data to put a definitive point on this thing. So what they did was they trained an algorithm to identify police reports for them. So they trained an algorithm so they fed in a bunch of police reports and trained it to identify reports that are classified as major or minor, and they have a corpus of documents that they know are serious and that they know are minor, the algorithm learns from that and then starts categorizing reports for them, and then they have to go back and check the results. But they found that a significant portion of them was categorized. And that's exciting. Machines are really good at doing things that are that humans are really bad at. Huge documents, reviewing large amounts of data, and pulling things out. And machines are really bad at the more journalistic side of that, which is like reporting it out and trying to understand it and being able to store it. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about was the story that ProPublica did. So ProPublica is really, I think, the leader in the future of where data journalism is going. And that's probably because they have the ability to do that. That's sort of their purpose. They want to do big investigative features. They want to do big impact journalism. They have a huge team of data people. They can hire people to spend 6 months or a year on a single data story. So this is a story they did that's sort of in reaction to the last stuff I was talking about machine learning. So it's not just journalists that are using machine learning, artificial intelligence algorithms. As in a lot of these cases, it's the private sector that's using this stuff first. And there's a number of companies in the US that use algorithms to help in sentencing people. So when people are going to get sentenced, certain states can use this program that administers a risk score. So they can, so they ask these people who are going to get convicted a bunch of questions with like a quiz, like would you steal bread if you were starving, stuff like that, and it spits out an assessment, a risk assessment, and judges can use that to help determine whether someone's going to get a really long sentence or a really short sentence based on the risk that they would do another crime. And they found that it was heavily biased against black people. And that the rates for white people, they were much lower, like the risk score ended up being much lower. So it's sort of an interesting reaction to algorithms out in the world that they're not perfect. I mean, we could talk a little bit about the trust that people have in data, but it's a good example of the algorithms. If you say the word algorithm, you say data, and you produce a number at the end of the risk score. It might seem like a solid piece of evidence, like it's sort of hard to dispute one number, but what we're discovering now, and this has kind of always been the case, is there's a lot of subjective decisions that go into a story before that that we can challenge and debate and talk about. So yeah, those are a couple things. So I guess I'll just welcome David to the stage and we'll have a chat and take questions. Talk show.
This one? Yeah. So tell us how you really feel.
Well, I learned that this is being broadcast on Facebook Live, right? So probably archived further. So I don't really have to watch what they say.
Thank you for that introduction to this world. And I should also point out that Stuart is an incredibly generous human being. Now being at the New York Times, prior to that, the Wall Street Journal, whenever someone who's a Luddite on this stuff, like myself, has reached out to Stuart to ask him for advice or input, he's never once said no. So, all of you are lucky to have Stuart here with us, all the way from New York. I want to go back a little bit, if I may. You were at Western.
Yeah.
You were the editor-in-chief of the Gazette.
Yes.
At that point, did you already know that data journalism or graphic design was something that you were gravitating towards, or was it all about graphs and things?
I think, as a lot of people, I was entering the industry at a time that was pretty bad, and it was getting worse, I'd say. And I was looking for something to differentiate myself. At the time I started programming again in sort of late university, and I guess I just kind of enjoyed it. I could spend hours doing it. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I really liked reporting, and then I felt I needed an edge, because I wasn't the best reporter or writer in my own student newspaper, so how was I going to get a job in the real world? So I had to find something to give me a little bit of an edge, and I wasn't sure what that would be. I kind of did some programming, some website design stuff, and when I got to the Globe and Mail, I sort of sent them a bunch of stuff that I could do, and I was like, if you need any of that. But the bicycle collision data, that wasn't an assignment, and that wasn't even my real job. I don't know if like more on subs in the audience, but I kind of used to drive it nuts because we would work, our main job was working on like, multimedia, back then I was a multimedia editor, and I had to, I just found that data and tried to shove it in between all the rest of my work. So yeah, that's kind of the evolution of it. It's on the edge somewhere.
I called you, I think it was a year ago. I was working at the Toronto Star, and I said, okay, we're going to build a team. What are the skill sets in 2017 that we need to have? And your advice back to me was, well, I asked pointedly, do we need hardcore engineering experience in coding, or do we need visual? And you, I was surprised, it makes sense now to me, but that you actually lean more towards the visual. Why, do you still feel that way, and why so?
Yeah, I think like one thing for especially the students to think about is, so I've been hiring these people for 4 years straight. I've always had an open position, and it's hard to fill that. But the way that we've tried to fill it is think about the overlapping skill sets of design, journalism, which could also be like reporting and writing, and programming or some kind of like technical ability. And the ways that those overlap for people are different, and the makeup of your team can depend on the skills overlap. I've tended to shift a little bit over time. When I think I first got into this, it was much more important that you could actually code and create. Like the creating skills were really important. So if you could go to a newsroom and actually like build the thing that you were talking about, that was really important. We really valued, as the bicycle collision thing showed, really valued like a bunch of visuals and some things you can click on. It was really, really important. But over time, those skills have become less important, I think, because this was probably true of all the technology. It gets democratized over time. There's plugins and tools and new companies pop up that can do a lot of the really tough work for you. That's probably what's going to happen with the machine learning stuff. There's a couple libraries out now. We need a ton of technical expertise to do that. In the next 5-10 years, we might not need that. So over time, we've shifted a little bit more towards the reporting skills. So the people I look for now are, really, really good reporters who have something, like one other thing. Usually that's some kind of data analysis ability and some kind of technical ability, but that doesn't have to be. Some people are more data viz or visual thinkers. And yeah, we were talking about like the makeup of the team. I do think design is extremely important, but it's tough for newsrooms that are just trying to get some data going on to think really deeply about how it all looks in the end.
So just structurally, at the Wall Street Journal, I think in team of 40, maybe around that size.
Yeah, it's about that.
And at the Times, in the opinion section, how many people do you have?
3.
Okay, and how do you structure that team?
Well, I have 2 plus open position, so which we haven't filled yet. But it's so I do like a player coach kind of thing, which is pretty common in this industry, which means that I make a lot of stuff in addition to trying to run the team and just kind of strategy stuff. But so I do most of the reporting and programming, and I have a designer who's the best designer in the world, I think. Just Yama, look her up, she's amazing. And yeah, we just sort of like a 2-man team right now. But they've changed from like the 30 people that you had at the Journal, but it's different priorities, different kind of work we're trying to do.
And just at the Journal, at 30 people, what was the makeup of full stack developer versus designer versus reporter?
I think when I started there, and this is a good sort of like evolution of where the industry is headed, but when I started there, it was mostly charting people, like chartists. And some of the people that retired over time, their whole job was making charts. That is a job for like tools now, like pasting your data in a chart. You need some technical expertise to understand like, what a good chart is and stuff like that. But by the time I left, we had created a couple different teams. One was an enterprise visuals team, which the whole point of that was to create visual stories from nothing. So one of the things we talk about a lot is when you look for visual stories, you tell different stories, and that's the same for data. And it's a bit of a mind shift from regular kind of reporting, because you might do reporting and look for data that can support you. But what we're trying to do, and I think the future of the industry, is looking for stories that can only be told through data. And we've probably saw a couple examples in the great show and tell. But that's a definite shift, and there's a lot of really good examples like the machine bias thing from Publica. That story doesn't exist unless you have the ability to analyze data. So yeah, I think over time we got much more into reporting, sort of graphics reporters, we call them, that kind of bring a mix of those skills that I talked about. Yeah.
Fascinating. We're talking about the front end. I mean, for now, we're talking about the back end and the inputs and all the reporting and the data. Just staying on the design and the front end piece of it. Are you at a point now where you have a sandbox to play in, where you don't have to worry about the constraints of a CMS or tech debt, or just basically drop it into the document or whatever? Or do you still find that there are limitations based on the technology that you're working with?
Yeah, I guess it's, well, the Times and the Journal are lucky that they have a bunch of tech people to set that stuff up, and then when they do that, you don't really have to worry about it anymore. That's not true of a lot of newsrooms, and like that bicycle collision example, that's not online, like the little chart map thing, that doesn't exist anymore. I went to find it, and it was taken offline because of the switch to like HTTPS. And it's now like blocked or whatever. So it's probably never going to be findable again, which is true.
So that incident at Boston Globe where one day all of our charts just disappeared.
Yeah.
And then you realized, oh yeah, we flipped over our protocols.
Yeah, so definitely go and save your stuff. The Journal, there was a hack at some point in like 2013. So every graphic and every interactive project that was ever made at the Wall Street Journal up until 2015 is not available anymore. It's all taken offline. And we like resurrected some of it, but you gotta think about that. That's your work, and it's not going to be around forever. But at the Times and the Journal, we don't have to think a lot about that infrastructure stuff. And I think if you're trying to enter the industry and thinking you have to know a lot about CMSs or the back end, you don't probably. And there's probably enough advance in the CMS and technology now that you don't probably have to worry about that.
Okay, last question on the front end. Style guides and design bibles and everything else. How do you translate that across platform, or does it matter anymore?
Yeah, like at both places, Opinion and the Journal, and actually the Globe had never had a style guide when I was reading the Globe. The Journal didn't have one when I got there, but we made one, because there's not really one at the Times either. It just has to look timesy. Well, I don't know what that means, but that's like their prevailing style guide. Yeah, I mean, for stuff like design, if you're getting into this and you are interested in the visual side, which I highly recommend, like if there's a huge demand for data skills in this industry in a way that there's not for reporting, and that demand is much higher if you add in visuals. The number of jobs is less because there's not as many newsrooms that have the ability to have that. But so I'm getting off track from your question. But what was your question?
Well, you kind of answered it, just in terms of design and thinking across platforms,
Oh, yes.
How that translates, how your thinking is translated from. I remember the Journal. You guys did a spread that was kind of taken from your digital work. I can't remember the story, but we talked about it.
Yeah, it was the election.
Yeah.
Okay, the worst day. The next day was the worst day. But yeah, like the stock guide stuff. I think that's like the evolution of newsrooms too. Over the last decade, getting into this kind of work, hopefully those processes will be put in place that people like us don't have to worry about that, and someone has thought about it and put it in place. Same with the CMS. Like old CMSs were horrible. They were not built for our work. They were strictly built to dump a bunch of text into, and that is changing for a lot of newsrooms. Not all of them, but yeah.
So what pain points do you still have?
I think the biggest one is probably trying to get the good work to happen and to stop the bad work from happening. So in the structure of how these teams work, often it's either there's one person, kind of like one-man army, who's doing his own thing and has the trust of an editor somewhere and is able to do work with a lot of the work that you're talking about, which is data, by the way. There's that, or there's like a team of specialists. And the team specialist model is like very, very risky because you can get a lot of editors with a lot of power, a lot of reporters with a lot of passion projects that will go to you and be like, can you do this, can you do that, for the thing that I'm really interested in. And that's risky because what we want to try to find, and for the people entering the industry, if you have journalism ability and the ability to like work with data, you need to be your own advocate for making sure that you get the stories that you're interested in, because you're going to know what a good data story is, much more than the people that have been doing this for 30 years, but have strictly been writing it in text. Those are very different skills, and it's almost a different mindset. So the pain point is really trying to fend off a lot of bad requests. It was especially true of the journal, because the way the team is structured to be more of like a service desk. But it's true at the Times too. I think every newsroom probably has that challenge of someone's kind of interest or project taking a lot of time, when there's really, really good stories that can only be told if you start from a place of thinking about what the data can tell you and what the data sources are. I think another one is probably the ability to build up sort of like a beat or like a specialty, or get permission to do the small stories. Like the show and tell was like the scope of some of those projects, very intimidating to me. Like that's like a big time investment, several weeks on something or longer. That's scary, but I think we need more permission, and for people entering the industry or doing the work, we need to ask for is permission to do the smaller stories that lead to those bigger stories over time. And that's something I've tried to fight for, probably poorly, is the ability to do a story that's not going to win all the awards, it's not even going to get that much attention or even that much traffic, but will help inform your next story and slowly build up to the biggest, big stories that you want to do by the end of the year that we'll look back on. And I don't know that these teams are often set up for that, because they're kind of like parachuted in on this big story because there's a big data dump somewhere. But you kind of need to build up that specialty. So if you're able to focus in on like a beat and kind of own something, that's probably where the big gems are going to come from. But it's hard to do that where like these skills are so in demand and there's only like 2 people doing it and everybody wants your time.
So I'll play contrarian here. We all talk about data, and you mentioned that maybe data sometimes itself is flawed. But I would even go one step further and say that access to the data is also questionable. It's improved a little bit, but for the most part, unless you're scraping that data yourself or doing the FOIAs or ATIPs yourself, the data sets you have are in and of themselves definitive or defining the story structure that you can possibly pursue. So how do you overcome that and find data beyond what's publicly available or what's accessible through ATIPs or FOIAs, so that you can really get that full rounded view of the work? Because the one thing I've always, as an editor, been concerned about with data journalism is you're telling me the output, but tell me more about the inputs, because the inputs themselves may have some bias, whether it's a racial bias or whether it's just an access to other data sets that could round out your sourcing. How do you work with that?
Yeah, that's a big question. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I noticed by going to the U.S. was the access to data is infinitely better, which is why it's really blossomed there, I think. I remember searching for like data on an election. I just like Googled like Wisconsin election data, and I went to the Wisconsin government website data portal. They had like all of this amazing data and like a phone number, and I called the guy in Wisconsin. And, like helped me and gave me all this data. What is this? I'm used to like filing like 4 FOIAs and then it's they give you a $20,000 estimate. I mean, I guess there's like a lot to unpack there. But one of the things that I've shifted in a little bit is like one of the reasons the show and tell is kind of intimidating is I've gone down that road so many times. And like this little chart of like motivation plummeting, like that's the point where I'm almost like, oh, fuck this. Like I'm gonna stop doing the story because it's so intense. One of the things I've really shifted in over time is really relying on the analysis of other groups, which is a lot easier when you're in opinion because you can use like think tanks, which means a lot because they do a lot of the analysis and then you can ask them for their data and add to that. But that's been a sort of a small shift in the way I think about data stories is because we're so fascinated by data, because we work with data and we really enjoy the process, even though it's excruciating, of like crunching big data. The promise of big data is, I mean, it's a really intimidating thing to get into because it takes so much time, and you're not sure if you're going to get a good story at the end of it. And I found that like the amount of time you spend trying to find data sources and crunch it, if you can find like the experts who've already done that work, they can really be like a shortcut to find the things you need. But like the sources of data, I mean, some of that's changing. In Canada, I'm sure it's just going to be a slow march to eventually having some kind of reasonable amount of public access to data. But yeah, I mean, it's probably not an easy answer.
There was hope here that there would be more transparency. There's always been regulation and policy over the last 6 months or so, and it's kind of fallen flat. A lot of empty rhetoric and very little changes to privacy or access to information. Part of it, I think, is I mean, in the U.S., from my experience, the constitutional freedom of speech element for all the questions about the U.S. Constitution right now and how valid it is or how it's working. That's it. That part of it has always worked. Americans are just far more willing to speak and can provide access to information than we are too. So I'm going to read a quote. I'm going to step up a little bit higher here to the 30,000-foot level. You are working in the opinion section of the New York Times, and so I can't resist. So I'll read a quote that was taken from, I went back and skimmed Precision Journalism, Philip Meyer's Bible for everybody here. If you haven't read it, please read it. Changed my life, actually. Philip Meyer, small story, he was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, and that's when he decided to go from, he was a mid-career journalist, just kind of milling about doing what we do, and discovered data and wrote about it in this book called Precision Journalism, and he actually shares anecdotes in it about sitting in Harvard Square and looking at the traffic lights and wondering when they were changing and why they were changing when they were. So when I did my Nieman Fellowship, his book was front and center in the bookshelf. I picked it up, and it changed my life too. That's how I got to meet Patrick King, who's here, and others, and how we built a little team in Global, and then from there, it went on. So, with that long preamble out of the way, I say Philip Meyer writes, in quotes, Walter Lippmann, and he writes in notes that in 1922, so almost a century ago, journalism depends on the availability of objectifiable fact. The more points, then, at which any happening can be fixed, objectified, measured, named, the more points there are at which real news can occur. I read that quote in the context of fact in the discourse in the U.S. at this particular moment. Working in the opinion section of the New York Times, I have friends who work at the New York Times in the opinion section, what that constant threat of being under attack for facts. I'm curious how you have lived that over the last year since the election, and whether you still believe that that quote in 2017, that objectifiable fact exists, does exist.
That's deep.
My role here is it's all just a hedge because data journalism, I'm all intimidated by you folks, so I can take this in a different direction.
There's a lot of it. Yeah, I mean, we're living in a really troubling time in the U.S., and I'm an opinion, so I can speak my mind. It's troubling. And yeah, I mean, there's an administration who dismisses fact and news supported by fact. I think there was a good story recently, even maybe yesterday, the Times put out on the deaths in Puerto Rico. I don't know if you guys saw this, but the official death toll in Puerto Rico after the hurricane is 65. And the Times did an analysis that showed closer to 1,000, based on the shift in the number of people who died in like other reports, not just like the administration's official account. Like data is playing an extremely important role in fact-checking administration who's interested in spin and misinformation and disinformation. Whether like, I guess your question is like whether objective facts still exist.
Yeah, and like, for example, do access Hollywood tapes really exist, or are they figments of our imagination? And maybe for half the population they exist and they're facts, for the other half doesn't seem to be
effect. So how do you, as a news organization, working for an opinion section of a news organization that is constantly under attack, how do you navigate that and still feel like what you're doing has impact?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we experience it in those terms exactly. Like, it's true that there's a big portion of the U.S. population that's not is not going to be moved by the facts that they're presented, and there's definitely like entrenchment and tribalism in the U.S. that is very extreme compared to Canada. That people confronted with facts that go against their opinions only serve to deepen their existing opinions. And the idea of fake news is meant to breed distrust so that people don't believe what they hear when they hear it. I think as data journalists, I think we have a big obligation now than in the past, and this was probably especially clear during the election. If you saw the New York Times homepage that showed Clinton with like a 90% chance of winning the election, I think like we could probably talk about that a little bit and maybe unpack that, but there's a bigger obligation now to consider the ways that this information is being read by people and whether they see it the same way that we see it as data experts. So Nate Silver writes a lot and is very, very critical of the media, which he's also a part of now, so I must be self-critical in some way. But he writes a lot about how any percentage prediction that's above 80%, people take as certainty. And that's really interesting in the context of the New York Times homepage chart that says 90% chance of winning, or even 80% chance, or even 70% chance, what impact that has on people. And I think we're only now coming to grips with the idea that we need to become a little more inventive with how we communicate, simple numbers. Like there's the belief that a number can't be easily argued with because it's a number, like it's based on something. But to your point, what information was going into that? If you dump a bunch of garbage in, then get a bunch of garbage out. And I think the models during the election were extremely, extremely important, and you could debate the validity of it. But if it said 90% chance of winning and then Clinton won, everybody would be praising those things and saying that they were perfect and flawless. I think we need to do a better job communicating how much we really know, and also communicating numbers to people in ways that they can actually interpret them. So the 80% thing is probably not best expressed by 80%, but maybe by another sort of similar odds. One thing we were talking about is like, could you show a graph that showed like a roll of the dice or a coin flip? And 3 out of 5 flips, if they were heads, Clinton would win. But if they weren't, then she would lose. People can maybe understand that a little better. 3 out of 5 doesn't seem like you might get that sometimes, but not always. So I think that's one thing we're coming to grips with now is like how we communicate data to people in a way that they can really personally understand.
Do you think, you said in the style guide there's a Timesian kind of anecdotal Timesian style. Is there an anecdotal Timesian reader that you think about when you're going about your day?
You said reader? Yeah, I think like if you've ever been, I've ever been in a newsroom, I'm sure you've even created these, which are like little profiles of readers. Did you ever do that? They did that at the Journal and at the Globe, where they like write little, this is Steve, and he's like a 49-year-old banker. That was like everyone at the Journal was, 49-year-old banker for Steve. But yeah, there's an idea of this reader that's like, I think at the Times they talk about, that style has changed, Times it is, but they talked about how it's like, now it's become sort of like a cocktail party. Like there's a bit of like a more casual thing. It's less about like the old gray lady and more about trying to communicate to people in a more sophisticated way. So we definitely have like a more sophisticated audience. I think that's probably especially true in opinion. The people that are really into it, they're probably, like educated people that think a lot deeply about policy. But there's a much wider audience too. Like Trump's Lies wasn't aimed at that audience. I think it was aimed at a much larger audience of people who were already thinking those things, which kind of like jumped in front of where they were shining their spotlight. But yeah, and I think that probably informs the way that you report the story, the way you visualize it, the way you write it, in terms of like how sophisticated your audience is and how ready they are to
So we wanted to talk about a little bit about transformation and almost the business models and all the rest of it if you want. I'm happy to. But I guess how do you feel today? I mean, the Times just announced last week that they have 3.5 million subscribers, of which there's a healthy number in Canada. Are you, as you look around the landscape and your own experience in working in the institutional players, Globe, Journal, and now the Times, there's a lot of hand-wringing happening in Canada right now and in the US when it comes to VC money and BuzzFeed advice and everything. How do you feel? Are you optimistic about the future of media and journalism?
Yeah, I think so. I'm pretty optimistic. I think the reality for the future of newspapers and the future of journalism is going to be very different depending on who you are. It's like a boom time for the Times at a time when, you know, lots of papers in Canada are closing. Like there's sort of like a larger disparity now between big players who have a larger audience and can have a business model that's sustainable because they can ask a lot of people to pay a little bit. And it's not, that reality does not seem reflected at a lot of other newspapers and smaller newspapers especially, who are struggling to find a business model that works for them. I think like Canada's I'm not sure what it means to the future of Canada. I haven't lived here for a couple of years, but you know, I talk a lot about to people that I know that like there's a lot of jobs in America. There's a lot going on, and you know, you're sort of like small to medium-sized state paper is sort of the size of the Globe and Mail. Like there's a lot more opportunity. I'm kind of curious, and you know, now I'm back this weekend, I'd like to hear a few people too about what they think. But like, what does the future of journalism in Canada look like? I'm optimistic because, you know, this conference exists. There's great work going on, and you know, there seems to be like growth happening in this area. At the same time, data is just becoming like journalism, sort of like in an inseparable way that before it was like sort of this like niche thing that some people did, and there was a lot of optimism around. I think some of the optimism has subsided a little bit. That shouldn't get us down because this is sort of like the more realistic world we're living in, where you know, data is just a part of the report, and hopefully there's some people, hopefully the people that are here today that can go into a newsroom and really make a big difference with, you know, technical skills and the ability to do the work. But I'm optimistic. I think like Canada's made, I don't know what the future of Canada holds. I think for the US, I'm still optimistic. Sorry, that was a very sad conclusion.
Yeah, I think for the people here who are doing a highly unique skill set, how many of you have heard of CB Insights? It's a technology media publication. It's not actually a publication. It's a site that scrapes, mostly scrapes just internet for company filings and for particularly around angel investing, seed investing rounds, and all the rest. And they provide a daily email snapshot of what's happening in the industry. They also take lenses, so they would say, you know, here's what's happening in Canada around artificial intelligence this year. We're seeing this many companies grow and all the rest of it. And they have a high subscriber base. They do employ journalists and editors, but mostly it's machine learning and scraping combined to generate a publication. And so you know, when we think about the future and we talk about the future, there's lots of opportunities to do different kinds of storytelling in ways that provide intelligence for people. Maybe not the same traditional pyramid principle type of, you know, reporting, but there is a lot of that is coming out, and that's interesting. And I think Canada can play a unique role in that space because of our, say, you know, China and the US are both going to be heavy players on AI. Canada is already a serious player on AI, but we have this unique independence that can kind of speak to our journalistic independence in the same way. So, yes, I would love you all to work in traditional newsrooms and do great reporting, but there are other things that you could look at and should look at as you think about where your career is going to go, and the role that Canada and Canadian, the act of journalism can play in that space. I don't know if you guys are experimenting with things like that in terms of providing intelligence through market
the scraping of data.
Yeah, I think like scraping is one of the tools we definitely use. There's like the segments of the Times and segments of newsroom is really that are working with like advanced sort of artificial intelligence, machine learning stuff. A lot of that stuff is to do with like reader analysis, sort of audience metrics, stuff like that. And there's a lot around like tools and stuff like that that will probably, enter the newsroom in a more robust way in the future. I was kind of curious to hear from you, though, as people like, especially the students that are entering. One thing we think about a lot is the justification, sort of like the business justification for having these roles. And like when you listen to the show and tell, a lot of that stuff is very time consuming to do this kind of work. And the business case is there, and the Times, like there's a certain sort of like prestige element to doing that kind of work, like having big ambitious visual journalism projects, having like really cool drone shots, like that's like a thing, a requirement now, I guess. Yeah, that's some drones. Like it's kind of becoming a cliche, kind of swoopy drone shots can really have. But sure, like I think there's a justification for that. If you want to be playing at the national level, you have to have a big mix of content among that visual data journalism. As we talked about, like a business case for that kind of is a little bit unclear from you go, but like as sort of like an editor and in the mindset of publishers, how do you think about that kind of thing? How do you, what criteria are you looking for to justify that, and does that hold up? And like people that are entering the field now should feel confident that these skills are still going to be in demand in 5 years.
There was a story a couple of years ago that the Times did languages and geographic behavior around languages that immediately shot to being their most popular story of all time.
Yeah, it's also a book you can buy.
Oh, okay, really? And actually that was data that they got through researchers in the university, so it wasn't their own stuff. Stories like that, in Boston we had a story that was a running thread of snowstorm accumulation. Not complicated, but it was unpacked, but basically just constantly updated using National Weather Service data with storm totals. Your Trump's lies thing probably has a long tail and retributive, I would guess. Those stories convert readers. They kind of play this double whammy, there's a combo of both scale, and that they talked about, and they become conversation pieces. But more than that, in my view, what's more important is they create engagement, retention, loyalty, return visits, all those things. And as more and more organizations pivot, I said the pivot word, but shift from playing in the game of scale to playing in the game of engagement, loyalty, and retention, the types of stories that you're mentioning, they only matter more. Because if you're going to get people to pay for your work, it has to be engaging, and it has to make you want to come back. The one thing I would say is, the Times plays, and the Journal, and the BBC and CNN and CBC in this very large multimedia, CBC did this amazing Halifax explosion 100 years later thing, and bringing secret location, you do all these wonderful, huge projects. I actually don't think those are needed anymore. I think that those are worthwhile things for large-scale publishers who are essentially multinational corporations at this point, the Cokes and Pepsis of our generation, of our industry. Keep doing it. You're pushing the boundaries, we're learning things from it and all the rest. But my experience has been a highly engaging story, deeply reported, original, that actually drives conversation is the most effective way to convert people to become paying subscribers to your site. I had the great fortune of managing two sites, Boston.com, which was a free version of the Boston Globe, and BostonGlobe.com, which was their paid site. And between the two of those, I was able to see on the same day what stories were generating traction in all the facets of measurements that you would want to know. And time and again, consistently, and I'm sure you can validate this as well, the stories that are the ones that you do spend the most amount of time on, the ones that are the most deeply reported, whether they're data stories or traditionally written word stories, people stick around, they read them, they share them, they find the value in it, and they seek out that quality. And so I'm actually incredibly optimistic about future journalism. I think in Canada we have a bit of a behavioral sentiment shift that we need to have around paying for journalism. It's the kind of the default position in Canada is people won't pay for news. And I think we have to ask ourselves why that is, and maybe not put that on the reader, but maybe put that on ourselves and ask, well, are we really doing things that are worth paying for? Tough question. But that's the kind of thing that I'm asking myself every day now as I think about what I'm going to do. But to you, yes, I think that this stuff is all valuable. I don't think you need to do a 360 video and a drone and have a snowfall version 6 to convert readers. And I think sites like The Information or The Athletic are bearing that out.
Yeah, I think I'm optimistic for the future because I think right now we're seeing a little bit of a shift back to the fundamentals of data. And like when I first started doing this, it was a lot of like the big kind of splash stuff. But I don't know if I mentioned this, but that public story is probably one of the best data stories that I've read in a while. There's like 3 numbers in that story. Like it's not like a data story that we would have thought of before. It's really good for people that have an interest in data but really want to be reporters. Like there's sort of like it's tough if you just want to like be a writer these days. Like you want to be like a journalist. I don't know, like report and write stories all day long. Like that's great. I feel like that's a tough like skill set to use, especially when the users are shrinking. But if you can bring in like some aptitude with data, or from my point of view, like any kind of visual, if you're interested in visuals, please pursue it because there's like no candidates and like not that many people that are doing it, and there's a lot of demand that I see anyway. But if you have some aptitude with data, you can use that, but you don't need like all of the extra bells and whistles that we used to think of as kind of necessary. It's really back to just like telling good smart stories. Yeah.
I think it was under the Wall Street Journal's thing around Facebook and the different sides, the polarization of Facebook.
Yeah. Red feed, blue feed.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't even need to have a headline on that thing. You could have just put it out there and it would have had the same effect. It was powerful work.
Yeah, that was, for people that haven't seen that, it's called red feed, blue feed. You can look it up, and it's, these researchers released a study that they categorize different news sources as maybe conservative or liberal. And then one of the guys on my team, John Keegan, used the Facebook API to pull out all the stories that were from each of those publications and then sort of set them off side by side, in case of design playing a huge role. And you can look on a topic like Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton during the election or emails or a number of different things and see how both sides are reporting it. And it really tapped into, really exposed the huge gulf in the way people were consuming news that really reflected the way, kind of what people expected. Like there's a huge disparity in the way people were thinking about the election, the news that they were getting on their Facebook feeds, sort of like peering into, your crazy aunt's like Facebook page because she's followed by conservative sites or whatever, which is like a thing in the US. I don't know. It was like New York rules, crazy aunts. Anyway, it's a good story.
Questions? Love to have anybody with anything or comments or thoughts. Now's your chance to pick Stuart's brain. Hi. Do you guys need a microphone for this as well, or so we can just yell maybe?
So I found it really interesting when you mentioned looking for stories that can only be told with data. And how do we evaluate that when we're coming up with story ideas?
That's a good question. Well, if you're coming up with a story idea that doesn't make sense with the data, that would indicate that it's like a data-driven story, right? Like the only way to report that story would be to look at the data and see what's your conclusions. I really liked what you said about having sort of like a methodology, a hypothesis. A lot of the times we'll start looking at data and there'll be like an interesting data source, but we're not totally sure what's there. But I think like even the act of starting at that point, like there's a big data set, we're curious about like a government agency or study a report that is based on data and starting from the point of analyzing that rather than saying like, you might complete a story. Like the typical way that a lot of people work is they'll write a story, and then try to like add in data later. Or like I get these emails sometimes of like, can you gin this up with some data? Like, no, like don't do that. That's a horrible way to work. And maybe that sort of would be improved by some data, but you really, if you start from the point of looking for data first, then you're kind of set up to like discover the stories that can only be told that way.
Yeah, and I would just add, I'm having a lot of fun this morning leafing through precision journalism, and I took some notes on it because it reminded me of a few things. Journalism is really the act of finding information, evaluating and analyzing it, and then communicating in a way that fixes the information overload, right? And so finding that information, how to find that information, whether it's data or just a conversation with 20 people that can turn into data, it's still really the same principles. So my advice would be approach it from I need to know something, and how do I discover that? And then if you're going to go down the data side, it's fascinating. Philip Meyer had 6 principles here. I'll just read them out for you quickly. Collect it, store it, retrieve it, analyze it, reduce it, communicate it. Which I thought was a fun little side tangent. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Me? Yep. How do you think through kind of like the public's ability to absorb and understand data-driven stories, and kind of trying to balance the risk maybe of misinterpretation, especially when you're getting into the more complex side of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. On the data viz side, Alberto Cairo, you should follow him, he's great, and he does a lot of research on this point, like how do people understand data often as it's visualized. One thing he looked at a study that showed people don't understand scatter plots. And scatter plots are great. They're very illuminating for me, but I literally spend all my time thinking about data and visualization. I think like we haven't done nearly enough to think about that. And there's a certain push in sort of like the data visualization community for like, there's a sort of cliche like it should have been a bar chart. Like you could pretty much look at any chart that exists and be like, yeah, it should have been a bar chart. Like a bar chart would be the clearest thing. But we're also trying to engage people, kind of wake them up, make them excited, and that's not a bar chart research. It's not usually a bar chart there. There's not enough thinking around that. I think like the other side of it though is if you, just because you're working on a data story, so like the machine bias point, doesn't mean that you need data in there. And I think it would be a really good challenge. I only like recently thought of this, but like doing like a really, really, really strong data story that's like wholly based on data, that started with data, you require tons of data work, and then having like no numbers in your story. Because really, like, you don't want to be a spreadsheet journalist, which is like another term thrown around a little bit. Like, you interview the spreadsheet, you work on the spreadsheet, you sort the spreadsheet, and then you write about the spreadsheet. I think that's a horrible way to do it, but you're kind of drawn into doing that because you're so used to like getting excited about data. If you're like me, I'm like, yeah, I love spreadsheets. Like, I just want to be in there all the time. But yeah, it would be a really good exercise to kind of turn that on its head and really just at the end of the day write a good story that, and like people understand stories have been around forever. Interview people, human interest,
Writers fall in love with their words, photographers fall in love with their photos. I've found data journalists fall in love with their data, and the best thing that you can do is find your Luddite editor and ask him or her to take a look at it and see if they understand it. And 9 times out of 10, you would strip out 90% of all the spreadsheet stuff that's in there. And the other thing is, when it comes to form, I think mobile's actually been really helpful in this, and that's forced the data to be integrated in an easy way so that it's a linear story, back to being a linear story as opposed to all the interactive stuff that we used to throw in these things so that you can click everywhere. You can't do that on a mobile device, and so it's actually forced, I think, in a good way, the data journalism to fit into the confines of the storytelling mechanism or platform that you have. Sorry, behind. Yes.
What's the potential of data journalism in wire agencies like AFP and AP who can't spend so much time in collaborating data? What's the potential for data journalism in wire agencies like AFP and AP?
Yeah, so the potential of data journalism in wire services. AP is a total leader in data journalism. They put that report, which you should check out. They have an amazing team there, and it's quite a large team too. And they have like a data investigative team, a bunch of data journalists, they have data visualizers. they're doing a ton of work all the time. One of the cool stories they did is they worked with a satellite company, Digital Globe, to find like a ship in the ocean, and it was, I forget the story exactly, but it's in that report, and they used like machine learning, and there's a ton of work going on at AP. And yeah, I mean, it's not that much different than any other newsroom. They have a lot of resources, and they have a huge international team, so that's really exciting. And yeah, they can really like take an international view of the story in ways that even the Times like can't necessarily always do, or do in like a really dedicated way, like our sources can.
Reuters as well, a lot of automated stories when it comes to financial stories, as well as watch during the Olympics. Take a look at some of the Olympic stories and the structure that they have, because a lot of it will be automated as well. Lots of questions, yeah.
You mentioned that visual journalists sometimes need to be their own advocates in doing the stories that they want, and getting requests from, can you just add some data to this? Do you have any advice for trying to shift that culture in the newsroom and getting people more on side and making it easier to be your own?
Yeah, that's what I worked on for 3 years at the Journal, was to do that, because when I got there, it was like chart desk. Like here's a spreadsheet, and they would send you a spreadsheet and write the headline on the deck in the email, and you would like spend time, and that was like really that was what they needed to do for a long time. Like I remember I did sorry, I'm getting a little tangent, but I did a content analysis once of the number of print charts, and the Times did like 5 print charts in a week. The Journal did 110. 110. So they were very like, and this is part of the Journal's evolution, but they're very, very much focused on charting stuff. Usually, or often, because it's in response to a completed story. Like the story is done, this page is looking a little dull, it's like in the business section, it's in the market section, it's not all photos, so yeah, they would do that. My one big piece of advice is get out in front of it. If you can, do like, sort of like, I used to do like a tour, or speak at every single like new employees event. I had kind of a presentation I would give, and I would have like sort of like an ongoing tour and talk to people and tell them like, here are the things that we do, here are the things we try to avoid, and if you can, come up with the rules. Like one of our rules was we don't add data to stories where the data is not crucial to that story. That's not to say that this data wouldn't help. Like the data can definitely help. When you finish the story, like wouldn't it be great if you did like a chart of the murder rate in the city or something? Totally can help. But that comes at a much, much bigger cost, an opportunity cost, not doing the stories that are only possible because of data. So if you can like walk around and talk to your editors, and maybe that's not you, maybe that's somebody else, but getting out in front of it, and I was shocked at how receptive editors were to that thinking. Like they don't know. And we kind of think that they know, or they kind of act sometimes like they know, but they don't know. And when you start telling them like the rules and the do's and don'ts, they actually respond to it more than I expected. Yeah.
Also remember, you're a victim of your own success, right? That it actually is a positive, because there's a lot of people in the newsroom who are just sitting there quietly, not being noticed. So that's a good thing. But also, I think, just to add to that, set up training sessions yourself, because a lot of journalists don't even know how to sort or filter at the table. So, the more you can do to get them to do it themselves, the less those kind of requests will come to you, and you can kind of push them aside in that sense as well. Okay, we have very little time, so I was thinking we could kind of battle around. We'll do one quick 3 questions, and then another 3 questions, if that's okay, David, and then we'll move on. Okay, so you start.
Thank you. First, could you repeat the name, Stuart, could you repeat the name of the story that was done on the information that the researchers released about the bias in media coverage?
I'll take that and then.
Sure.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I had a follow on.
Oh, okay.
Very quickly, you mentioned that there's a lot of jobs in the States for this, but in the current political climate of the States, how welcoming are Canadians going to be? How welcomed are Canadians going to be to go south to take these jobs?
Oh, they love Canadians.
H-1B visas are a hit, so I just want to keep getting. Okay, other questions, and we'll just do a lightning round.
Yeah. So.
Oh, okay. We'll do the questions and then we'll answer.
Yeah.
So my name is Asim. I have a PhD in data mining.
and I know that we can use historical data to predict the future in many application fields. So based on your point of view, how do you see prediction in journalism?
Okay, great. And third question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, myself and a few other journalists I know have learned programming, hoping to combine them and enter back into a newsroom. You spoke a bit about working in a newsroom and the environment, but what advice would you give to people who are hoping to enter kind of data-driven journalism?
Okay, great. So first, and then this side of the room will take 3 questions. Bias, the bias study, and
Yeah, it was a public story, right? It was called machine bias. Okay.
No, not that one. The other one.
Filter bubbles one?
I'm sorry?
Oh, blue feed, red feed.
Red.
Blue feed, red feed.
Oh, blue feed. Thank you very much.
Okay, jobs in the U.S.
Canadians are always welcome. I would love to talk visas. It's like a hobby if you live there. And newsrooms don't understand visas at all, so they'll totally interview and then figure out later how to.
Well, maybe we should talk about this with Facebook Live going on, but the H-1B, I will say, is really tough to get now, although, you know, for some of the people in this room having engineering backgrounds, you could probably go in under a TN, but...
I was on both, so yeah.
Okay. Historical data and predictive analytics. Your question was basically how effective do you think predictive analytics can be in telling stories?
I think that's a growing part of the industry. So that around the election, I'm sort of like projecting where people will be. I haven't done a ton of work in that, but it is growing, and you need a lot of technical expertise, which is probably why it's slower to start. But like with machine learning, as more really smart people do it, they'll make tools that the regular people can use, like people like me. So that's probably something that will become a bigger part of the industry.
And advice for data journalists trying to enter into newsrooms.
I kind of missed what you're saying. Are you saying you're a programmer or you're a...
So I work as a programmer now, but I worked as a journalist for many years before and kind of learned programming, hoping to combine the 2 skill sets.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's huge, and those are often opposing skills. So it's rare that you'll find someone who's like a good writer or interested in writing or interested in journalism, and they can really program, not like, you know, sketch out some HTML in Notepad or something, but like really get into it. And more than that, like care about it and enjoy it. Because that's, like caring about enjoying it, if you do care about and enjoy it, then that's how you like really improve your skills over time, because it's a horrible slog to learn new programming. But if you have a story, then you can like work through those moments where where you just want to die. Maybe we can talk more after this.
Okay, there were a bunch of questions on this side. We'll take 3 last ones if there are, and then we'll wrap it up. Lindsay, gentleman in the blue, and gentleman in the back. Okay, Lindsay.
I guess as quick as possible, it's a bit self-serving though. I'm curious if there's any interplay in the newsrooms or news organizations you've worked in or work in between audience teams, audience development teams, and data journalism teams in all their forms. Self-serving, I work in audience, and I think the skill set is so complementary. I don't see a lot of that.
Great.
Yeah. So, do you think there's still a place for or a demand for specialists in the newsroom? Because graphic specialists or web developers, software engineers, data experts, or do you think that the future is purely journalists who have certain skill sets in these areas plus off-the-shelf third-party tools?
Right. Yes, sir.
As someone in journalism school right now, it's hard to know what new skills to focus on. Can you speak a bit more about what you see as being obsolete in 5 years? You mentioned that engineering skills not necessarily, but becoming more prone to machine learning.
Okay, so I think we can kind of wrap those 2 questions at the end together, but the first one being the interplay between audience development, engagement teams, and data journalists.
There's not much. I think you're right, there's complementary skills. At the Journal, there was a team that worked on that, and they would make programs to analyze how the audience was acting. And they had an editorial mission, like 20% of the time was editorial. So we would borrow them, and they were like a bunch of PhDs, and they would help us build like models and stuff like that. Yeah, there's good overlap there. I haven't done a ton with that though. But yeah, there's probably more we can learn. Like we do click tracking sometimes to see how people are interacting with our work, which is sort of like an audience adjacent kind of thing. There's probably more of that though.
In terms of the specialist versus generalist debate, and then also just wrapping into that, what new skills you see
Yeah,
needed?
there's definitely a need for specialists. It's just you have to have an organization with enough size to like warrant that. Really, like the basic thing you need if you're building a team like this is more of the journalism side. Like you need somebody to produce stories. You could also maybe create a team where you have more of like a service desk, where you have an expert, and they can just kind of like fly in, work some data, and produce some stuff that reporters might use. But I think what we're seeing is like more of a push towards the journalism side, probably because there's more people entering who like know how to code, and they can bring both. Whereas 10 years ago it was really like, okay, well you have to hire a bunch of data scientists because there's nobody who's a data scientist and a journalist. But we are seeing more of that now. But specialists are hugely, hugely important. I don't want to downplay that at the level where you can kind of like afford them and, afford them both in like pay, but also like, staff. Like you can have a team that size. And there's people at the Times and the Journal who are like extremely, extremely talented in a very, very specific thing. And they're not like, they're not going to be writing stories. And that enables them to do some of the really impressive big stuff they do. But I don't know that every newspaper will like get there. And sorry, the final question was about
new skills that you see being needed in newsrooms.
and what's going to be outdated. Like the machine learning stuff, I think that's really the domain of the specialists, the experts, and that's how that stuff will like filter into the industry. I think if you're getting into it now, I wouldn't really worry about that. Things that are falling away, I know like Tableau comes up every now and then. Tableau is an amazing tool for businesses to use. And like some newsrooms can use it, but I think if you're getting into it, I would use Tableau if it's for reporting reasons, and maybe you can publish that. I'm not gonna be angry about a Tableau chart, but it's a good reporting tool if you want to analyze visual data and go with other skills to do it. But that's one that comes up that I would maybe say like, don't spend all your time doing that if you can spend it on other things.
So I understand Stuart's motives to get you all to go work in the U.S., which is wonderful for him, but I think the better idea would be for us to get Stuart to come home. So we'll start with that. We started that today, and we'll try to do it again. Thank you for coming up to Toronto for this.
Is everyone having fun so far? Yeah, all right. That's good because we're running about 10 minutes behind, but it's okay because we're having fun. So we're going to go do some lunch now. Like we said, you can go get food around here, or we have some nice snacks and finger foods over there. We'll probably get started with the Google demo probably around 12:35, 12:40 now, and everything will probably be about 10 minutes. See, but we're having fun. So see you guys in a bit, and thank you.
And as a result, I'm an editor, and you say, okay, send George over the outcomes. So when you tell her about the outcome, yeah, and they sponsor
Which actually happened one day, like, so I no, it was just I don't know. Like, okay, I didn't get that text, like, are you alive? What's going on? I'm making so grab my coat. Probably should eat. Right? Yeah. Okay. So now give me 2 seconds later. Yeah. David showed all the calls. They also start with Twitter. And then oh, where's the fire? She's like, he's clearly use less words. Full words. We know something. Yeah. That was so awkward because I sent a voice note and I was like, oh, what's this? And I was like, I'll listen to the basic. Oh my God. I sent this like but it's very string. It's matching string. It's saying it's much more words. It's saying this type of string, this type of and it knows maybe it's words. Maybe oh yeah, others like so I'm doing all that. You know, it's just a database has a best information and what's in the background. This is where I've got this constellation of terabytes accumulating all these things. What I want to do is running something in the network. And how the store pictures in the labs, how is that show as we apply that learning what is now arising. Yeah, and then as time goes by, it becomes smarter, it becomes more effective at learning that. I don't know where to start. I mean, I've been playing around with Python and maintaining all these other inputs and trying to make sure that all that stuff is working. Learning the other machine learning techniques on Python stuff. And I just don't know where to start. You're welcome. Yes. There are ones. My wife works in health. Get back to me. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
To have the same thing as with the right copy, we can share this 24 hours or next month, something like that. We will be the first one to talk about that.
Yeah. Because I mean, it's just so many different directions. Each one of these components, you know, I feel that it's good to have a starting point and where to go. So I mean, there's so many points. Yeah. There's nothing new. One thing I've worked with on the internet, everybody has faced similar challenges. It's a matter of time that somebody else is actually competitive. It's very rare to get an original product. There's been some version of it somewhere. Finding that.
Yeah, as I said,
yeah. Yeah.
So it based on your requirements.
Yeah. Well, I'm a one-man show, so maybe we'll talk.
Yeah.
I have to build a business case around it. Anyway, I'm gonna go get some. You know.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
You don't have it, so that's why we don't do it. It's not fair to people.
Yeah, it's there to use most of
And that's prohibitive, especially it's almost like that's
Yeah.
The city guy said, hey, well, why don't you ask me? Give it just something for our panels more esoteric one, kind of a bigger picture at the end of the day. We started with people here with ideas, but
Yeah. Well, I almost go forth now. Accept the challenge.
Right.
You know, especially the young students are going to be graduating.
Right. Go for it. Right, right, and the guy who lets you out, he sent letters to everyone. Was it him or was that Robert? Robert, anyway. Yeah, because we want to keep your income status. So when you put the people in the shop,
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.